Vivian Felten, and I work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm the statewide outreach coordinator. We do have some local conservationists here. William and Sarah, raise your hands, and Annette. But for those of you that don't know, NRCS is a non-regulatory federal agency. We work with farmers on all size farms and all landscapes, urban, rural, suburban, to help with improve their natural resources on the farm, like soil, water quality, air quality, energy efficiency, crop and animal health. We have technical and financial assistance programs to help implement conservation practices. We come out to your farm, we assess your farm and your resources, and we help identify conservation practices that might help improve your resources. And you're going to hear about some of those conservation practices farmers are going to talk about. Just keep in mind that those are things that we might be able to help you implement on your farm. And I also want to let you know that the Farm Service Agency is here, Amy Fusco. And if you do want to work with USDA agencies, it's best to meet with them and get your farm in the system, your records updated, and they have some great programs for disasters, loans and insurance. And so with that, we're going to get started with the farmer panel. We have 3 farmers. We've got Dan Carr from Beavertides Farm, and Jana Siller from Adamah Farm, and Paul Ruchelia from Fort Hill Farm. And we're going to have them talk about your farm about 5 minutes, a little bit about your operation and what soil health practices you've done and your experiences with that. And I think we're going to start with Jana.
Great. Hi, so I'm Jana from Adamah Farm up in Falls Village. So we're just all the way in the northwest corner, close to as far north and west as you can go. And our farm is very diverse. We do a lot of different things. We're an educational program also, in addition to a production farm. So we do so many things, but the business part of our farm is the vegetables. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the other things, but I brought some pictures of our veggie production. So you can see this is part of the farm here. And I'm going to talk about some of the different practices actually that we use that you can kind of see in this. So I just made a little album and I put the same picture at the end so we can kind of zoom in to some of the pictures. But you can see we're on a slope. It's pretty woodsy. You can see the compost yard there in the sort of bottom left. So we're located at the Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center, and we take all the food waste from the retreat center and we compost it in big piles. That's also, you see the chicken coop because the chickens scratch it up and turn it, and we don't have to really buy hardly any chicken feed because they eat the pizza crust and things. And we take also a lot of local compost, so food waste. Our town just started maybe municipal composting, but until then, a lot of folks have used our piles. And so that's a big part of our soil health is our composting. I'm not sure if I mentioned we're about 20 acres overall, but the veggies are about 3 acres. So we're making all our own compost for 3 acres. And that's a big piece of it. So let's see. Okay, so this is kind of how we used to mostly do our bed preparation and how we still do about maybe a third of it, which is that we grow really tall cover crops. This is in May and we mow them down and then we till them in. And I love the rototilled look. Just planting these potatoes, like there's something very calming to me about seeing just smooth, there's nothing in it. We've mixed in all the cover crops, we've mixed in all the compost. So I think I'll definitely never get rid of our rototiller, not just because it's a relaxing scene to me, but also because it's really, really useful in those moments where we want to do a quick turnaround between big cover crops and plants. So, and you know, our veggie plants. So we haven't found a way that's nearly as quick as being able to really smash up the soil. But we also know that there are detrimental effects to our soil health of the rototilling. You know, and it looks so fluffy, but in a month it's going to be really, you know, just compacted, and we do get a crust on the top that it really affects our moisture in the soil, and of course all the unseen little microbes under there that are giving us so much benefit to our overall yields are having a hard time when we do that tillage. So we've slowly over time we've switched to as little amount of tillage as we can do. So this is our potatoes this year that were planted in a no-till plot with living mulch pathways. So you can see like on either side the mulch. So this is one example of sort of something we've done to get rid of the cover crops and move into our veggies is the crimping, and this is just by hand, smushing it down with a T-post. I should say too that our context is really, really particular. We run educational programs, so we have a lot of volunteers. Our farm really has a lot of hand labor, folks who have no experience in farming, often a great deal of discomfort with farming. So we actually can't mechanize because the people that we're serving really, that's not going to be in their wheelhouse. And we have a lot of hands. So these things that I'm going to show you are very particular to our context, where like they had such a blast and learned a lot in this, you know, hand crimping of rye, which is to kill it just by, you know, smushing it bit by bit. And that would not be practical in any other scenario that I can think of. Maybe it would be, but for us, it's practical in a certain way. And then, for example, you know, folks just moving big tarps, moving sandbags around. This enables us to just kill that cover crop that was crimped just a little bit more before we plant into it. There's a beautiful heron with these individually tarped. So this is just a different system of tarping that we use sometimes, where we put the individual tarps on the bed to keep the living pathways going. So that's my daughter coloring, but you can see, you know, how we're doing it to maintain those pathways. And that pathway system we developed because we're on that slope and we don't want to lose any more soil than we have to. And I heard about someone doing it on a podcast and I was like, really? You could just do that? And it has worked really well on our farm, again, because of our context. Lots of people who can push a mulching mower down an 18-inch wide path and actually are a lot faster at doing that than, you know, we don't have like path cultivators on a tractor. So again, for us in our context, it makes sense. And then it's really beautiful and really lovely. We have these living pathways. So yeah, to back up, the way that we maintain them is with a mulching mower just once a week, going up and down and mowing them. And they don't creep into the beds too bad, and we haul them back when we have to. So here you can see lots of people, lots of hand labor that can lift the tarps. And then this is broad forking, which we do. We don't have to do it every time, but we do it when we feel like the bed is too compacted. So that's just, you know, jumping on it and wiggling, loosening up the soil. And then the crops just look so, you know, these onions just really pleasing in a different way than the tillage. And then we cover crop our individual beds with the living mulch pathways. So we have like, you know, white clover down the paths, and then those are peas and oats growing in the bed. So this to me is really our goal with soil health. We're growing our own fertility. We're with the cover crops, and we don't have any bare soil. We're just maximizing photosynthesis on every inch. And like I said, it takes a certain amount of hand labor that, since we can't mechanize anyway, makes sense for us, but is particular. So like this is the cabbage crop with living pathways in between, and kale living pathways in between. Our teenage neighbor has a drone, so put him to work with that. and it was really exciting to be able to see these from above. So you can see like the patch there that looks all mulchy, that's crimped rye and vetch, but it took forever. You know, with a rototiller, I can turn around a nice big cover crop quickly, or with other tillage mechanisms, but it does take longer in this system. Oh, and then in addition to the veggies, another climate smart ag thing that we have going on is our chestnut agroforest project. So about 200 chestnut trees, and we got support actually for this project and also for some of our no-till equipment from BAV and from the NRCS and several other sources. But yeah, so we planted lots of chestnut trees, and this is phase one of sort of an agroforestry project, and we've been grazing our goats to some extent with the trees, but the trees have tubes that are protecting them at the moment, and the goats really like to knock them off. So when those tubes come off, it'll be more of an integrated animal and tree project. I think that's it. I didn't put that.
Okay, so next we're gonna hear from Paul and then Dan, and then we're gonna open up questions. Paul.
Thanks. My name is Paul Luchalia. My wife Rebecca and I run Fort Hill Farm in New Milford, Connecticut. We've been there about 21 years. We're largely a horticultural farm. We grow a wide variety of mostly vegetable crops. We also do some flowers and herbs, about an acre of strawberries, an acre of blueberries, and the annual crops is about 12 acres. We rent the farm from Sunny Valley Preserve, which is a project of Nature's Conservancy, and then we operate as an LLC on that land. We've built all the infrastructure, well, not all of it, most of the infrastructure that's on the farm. We've gotten a lot of help along the way from NRCS equip grants, Connecticut Farm Transition grants. Berkshire Ag Ventures helped us with some no-till equipment we can talk about later. We market through a farm stand on our farm, which also has a CSA component. People buy a card in the winter and then just come and get whatever they want during the season at our farm stand. And we also go to 2 farmers markets, and we have some wholesale restaurant accounts. In terms of soil health, things that folks might be interested in, we do a lot of cover cropping. That's been a big part of the farm. And I don't know how, we'll just do an overview. We can answer specific questions about that. We produce about 250 or 300 yards of compost on the farm, and the compost is a big part of our soil health program. We mostly use leaves that we get from local contractors and wood chips, so it's not a real like nitrogen-rich compost that you would get with manure or food scraps, but it's a great soil amendment that's really good for soil microorganisms and keeps things healthy in the soil. We do till a lot. I think the rototiller slides that Jana showed are kind of where we're at. We don't have a ton of labor. Labor is a real concern for our operation, probably what we've spent the entire winter thinking about. So we tend to try and find that sweet spot between things that are going to be ecologically good for our soil and doing a lot of diverse things on the farm, growing different crops and cover crops, and also trying to pay our people as well as we can. So that's a tricky order these days. One thing that's happened recently that's really great is we were able to get a lot more land, and rather than increase our production, we've been able to introduce perennial cover cropping systems into our farm. So balancing out the 10 acres that we're tilling, at the same time, we've got, we're still working into this, but about 6 acres that we'll have in alfalfa, grass, clover crops that are going to be out for 2 or 3 years in a build-up phase that we think is really going to be important for soil health and also weed suppression. One of the problem weeds that we've come up with lately is Galansoga, which has a really short ability to live in the soil. So we're hoping that we can kill a lot of it before we even start growing carrots. We have been experimenting with biochar on our farm with some help from the NRCS, and we've been really excited about that. Oh, is there a question?
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Wow, nobody's ever asked me to do that. Sure. We've been experimenting with biochar on the farm, and I can talk a little bit about that. We've just got some preliminary results. We've been working with a soil ecologist at UConn, Dr. Vijay Gann, and she did some field plots on our farm, and we have some preliminary information on that. We're also incorporating that into our compost. We've also in the past used some rock dust in our compost, which one thing I learned about rock dust that's really interesting is they can actually pull carbon out of the air, and in a way that's very different from lime, which actually releases a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. We can also talk about that. I think we've been trying to move towards no-till. Tarping for us is a recipe of frustration. We have a really windy farm, and it involves cinder blocks tarping. So we're moving away from that. We do want to do some more experiments with roller crimping. We were able to get a no-till drill, and we have a tractor mounted crimper. I have very limited experience, but I could talk a little bit about that system. We're hoping to do more of that in the next couple of years. Berkshire Ag Ventures helped us with that system, getting that going. And in our greenhouses, we've adapted some of the, we've actually not tilled in our greenhouses. We have about 3/4 of an acre under plastic at our farm, which I didn't mention. So, and that's actually a really big profit center in our farm. We grow we do a lot of tomatoes in heated greenhouses and unheated tunnels, crops like basil, early carrots, ginger have been really good crops for us. And those crops we mostly grow using a broad fork and a very, I like just tilling the top inch or two with a very light duty tiller. And that we've seen some in soil improvements that way. It is incredibly labor intensive because of the removal process. We're not able to really tarp in there. Tarping does not work over the winter. We've proved that. You really need some heat to make that work. But that's been an interesting system in our greenhouses that we haven't tilled in there in 4 or 5 years, and we are seeing some really good soil health improvements that way.
Okay, thanks. And now for more of a grazing perspective.
Yeah. I'm the oddball. I'm the livestock farmer. My wife and I also rent our farm from a private landowner. We're grazing about 50 acres, and we're hoping to expand that in the next year. Some adjacent landowners have also been interested in us grazing their land. We took over, our lease started in 2015. And when we first started, we were finishing beef cattle in sort of a custom grazing scenario with 2 other farms, one of which I was managing. But my wife and I were finishing beef cattle for that other farm on our land. And from a soil health perspective, we really focus on holistic planned grazing, and we've seen big soil health improvements over time by having a large animal impact and managing our animal impact using electric fencing, and then having a long rest period. So when we took over the farm in 2015, we were running about 70 head of stockers, so 700 pounds or more, that we were moving every single day, and we would have a rest period of about 45 days before they would go back to the same paddock. Since then, we've built up our own sheep flock of Katahdin sheep, a hair sheep for meat, and we have about 80 ewes, so ewes and lambs, about 150 more than 150 animals, and we've extended our rest periods. We have smaller paddocks now with the smaller livestock, and last year with the drought, we were actually able to graze some adjacent land, and we had as much as an 80-day rest period before going back. And from a soil health perspective, I think that that rest period is the key, having that animal impact and having a good recovery period for the forage. But balancing it out depending on weather in terms of keeping our forage vegetative, not allowing it to lignify, allowing it to go to seed. Last year, that was a mistake we really made. Early on, most of you guys will remember, around June, we had a real hot period after prolonged rain, and everything just kind of bolted, and our grass definitely did. And then we had a prolonged dry period throughout the summer, and a lot of our forage lost its nutritional value as it went to seed. So that's in our grazing planning. That's something we're trying to sort of account for this year and better plan for. So yeah.
Thank you. And assuming there are some questions out there.
So the researcher who did the work, we worked together to source bulk biochar, and she tried using it all several ways, either alone, just straight on the crops, or mixed in with compost, and with what we would consider a short incubation period of about 3 weeks. That showed the best results, and there's been a lot of work on biochar now, and most of the bulk of the research shows that it's generally best to incubate it with compost, because you need to charge the char. It has a lot of sites, and once they're empty, if they're empty and you put it in soil, they'll pull nutrients out of the soil system. But if you charge it, then you allow the char to charge with nutrients, and also to inoculate it with microorganisms. Biochar, though, we're still trying to figure out the economics of it, and we're also feeding it into our compost stocks on a large scale, and we have this new land that we've been able to put into production, and I'm curious to see if we can more rapidly increase organic matter. We have a really sandy soil. I didn't mention that. If you have a highly fertile silt loam, I don't think biochar is worth your money. But if you have a poorer soil with a low CEC, and you're having trouble building organic matter, if you are doing a little more tillage than you might like, which is definitely our situation, we're hoping that biochar can help even out that equation. What rate? Yeah, I wish you could tell me. We're still trying to. So if money's not an object, I've heard up to 30%. But money's an object. So, I would say a 5 or 10% is definitely safe. 30 and up to 30. Once you go beyond that, if you're applying raw char to fields, there have been many studies that have shown that could be detrimental to yield. So you really got to watch it. One other way we're thinking about doing it, using biochar, and also we have access to a lot of wood chips, which is another. It's not char, but it's a long-term reservoir of carbon that you can put in soils. And with this fallow blocks that we have in alfalfa, that would be a decent time to apply char, because that crop's producing its own nitrogen. And if you clip it, then it would sort of sheet compost. It's another way to do it. But just applying char to where Jana showed her potato field, if you just throw char in there, that is not a good idea. Yeah, that's really important.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't say, I'm located in Falls Village as well. Yeah,
Couple miles away.
yeah, closer.
We have a deer fence around the farm, which is also a bear fence. Yeah.
Keep bears out.
For us. Well, I assume it's the fence. Something keeps them out.
Must be
They never
NRCS
come.
standard.
Yeah.
I mean, I also have beehives and but I have electric fencing around the beehives, and then, you know, we have a high tensile fencing around the whole farm to keep the cattle in, which is generally quite hot. So I've never had any trouble with the beehives. Do you have crop damage from bears? Or?
We have not.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. When I first set up the electric fencing around the beehives, it was before I had put up the high tensile fence. I baited it with bacon, and my neighbor who happened to see a bear get zapped, and you know, they got that first shock on the muzzle. And the thinking is, you know, there's likely the same bears are going to be patrolling the area, and you want them to have that one really bad experience out the gate. Yeah, so I do. Yeah, for sheep, we have Maremma dogs that live with the sheep. Yeah. Yeah, so well, we are no longer custom grazing for other folks, and but we buy in stocker cattle every spring, and we mix them in with our sheep. And usually we have to have them in an adjacent area to begin with, to get used to the dogs primarily. But we haven't had any problem with that since.
Oh, yeah. So for the pass, I've found that white clover works really well. The seed's expensive, but we mainly just do it once, and I seed it really, really heavy. And then it takes a lot of foot traffic, and it does creep a little bit, and you have to knock it back. But yeah, that's worked well for us. Although, you know, also just whatever shows up, like, you know, sometimes grass comes in, and that works too in the past. For cover crops, I think it depends so much on what your goal is for what you want to accomplish with the cover crop. Like, are you trying to overwinter it? Do you want a lot of nitrogen? Do you want a lot of organic matter? What time period you have open? So we do lots of different cover crops. I would love to have double amount of land. That would make so much difference. And we don't. So we mostly are maximizing, you know, planting the fall over winter, and then integrating it in the spring, and a lot of rye and vetch and crimson clover and triticale and yeah, Austrian winter peas work well for that. And then when we want it to die in the winter, if we want to jump into the ground early in the spring, then we'll use oats and field peas. And then if we have an opening in the summer, which doesn't happen for us very often, but if we have a little bit of space that we can spare, then we'll use buckwheat, and that has a lot of, you know, good flowers for beneficial insects, and phacelia, and sometimes we've played around with a few others. Yeah, we do a lot.
Any cover crop recommendations?
Those are all real good ones. The only one I'd add to it is sun hemp, which is a crank and legume that gets like 8 feet tall if you let it, and is really weed suppressive. You can mix it with sorghum sudax if you have that sort of crops. Your spring crops are done, and you're transitioning. You're transitioning out of cash crops. That's a good one.
For me, it's very basic. Soil health leads to animal health. The healthier the soil, the healthier the forage, the healthier the animals. So that's very basic.
I mentioned that we have an educational focus, so that allows us to do a little bit more experimenting, and have a little more wiggle room. And I've been able to observe some really strong benefits. So like the no-till areas, that the moisture retention is a whole different game. Like when we have a drought, we can go so much longer without needing to worry about water. And same when we have big, powerful rain events, the soil just can absorb more, less ponding, less runoff. obviously those living pathways help a ton on our slope. And I do see, you know, without having to buy much expensive off-farm stuff, we do buy a little bit, but overall, you know, it's our cover crops and our compost, and that's what we're relying on. So, and then the crops grow really beautifully and they taste delicious. So yeah, and I think it can be a little misleading to maybe, I try not to overemphasize the carbon sequestration of what we're doing, because we're a small farm. We're not, you know, some of the bigger questions about climate are pretty important to address. And we are, you know, holding carbon in the soil. And I think when we're all thinking about that from each little thing that we're doing, you know, it adds up. So, but I think overall, just observing the plants, there's a real major soil health. Yeah.
I don't have too much to add. I think the more organic matter you have in your soil, the less stressed your plants are going to be, and in terms of water stress in particular, but also nutrients. And the tools you have as an organic grower to deal with particularly disease problems are really limited. And so the more you can stay away from, the healthier plants are, the less stressed they are, the more resistant to diseases they're going to be, and to some extent insects. And then you're not, there's less band-aids, and the band-aids are really small anyway, so it's really helpful that way. And it's really rewarding, you know, to see you know, land improve even as you're using it to produce food. So that's a really great feeling.
Thank you so much.